everyone, welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, U.S. President Donald Trump has vowed to ramp up restrictions on Cuba, reversing Obama's rapprochement with the island country. How will this affect Cubans in both Havana and Miami? In the run-up to the 20th anniversary of Hong Kong's return to China, we will have the first episode of our special program, Trailblazing Hong Kong Women. This time, we speak with RITA FAN, the first president of Hong Kong's legislature. And we begin our show in America, where U.S. President Donald Trump is set to get tough on Cuba. The president is expected to announce business restrictions for Cuban military-backed companies. Stricter enforcement of the rules for Americans traveling to Cuba is also expected. So what does it entail for people both in Cuba and in America, and probably even beyond? Let's take a look before our discussion.
Cafe Versailles, in the heart of Miami's Little Havana, may not be the heartbeat for the Cuban-American movement in the U.S., but it is arguably its soul.
Well, I've been coming here since I was 5 years old.
For nearly 50 years, Cuban exiles have gathered here on Calle Ocho, or 8th Street.
People come here to talk politics and try to resolve the problems in the world.
They watched nearly 2 years ago when then U.S. President Barack Obama pursued and secured a thaw in relations with its longtime nemesis, Cuba and the Castro government. Many Cuban exiles needed convincing. Some were persuaded. Ramon Sanchez, head of the Cuban-American Democracy Movement, explains his change in attitude.
The former policy did not work, obviously. It did not attain what it was supposed to, which was openness and democracy for the Cuban people. President Obama attempted to change that.
Early reports from Washington indicate U.S. is vowing to keep his campaign pledge to anti-Castro hardliners in South Florida. Trump could undo 2 years of progress in normalizing relations. Slamming the brakes on U.S. Cuba business deals and once again strictly limiting U.S. travel to the country. Even family visits in Cuba from U.S. relatives could be in jeopardy. Guadalupe Glass says she worked in the Cuban sugarcane fields in the late 1960s to save enough money to flee the country for South Florida.
It was very sad because we didn't have no friends and we didn't have anybody here, so it's rough.
Now she thinks Trump would be making a big mistake by tightening U.S. restrictions on the island nation.
Even that I didn't like in the beginning, I think it's better to have relations because at least the poor people that is there, they can get a little more now from us, from the family.
From all indications, U.S. President Trump wants to punish the Cuban government with a proposed rollback. But in talking to many Cuban Americans, many who had been hardliners in the past, they believe in the end it is going to be the poorest of people in Cuba that feel this sting the most. Sean Caleb's CGTN in Miami.
And for Trump's Cuba policy, joining us in the city of New York, we have Ted Hanken, who is a professor in the Department of African American and Latino Studies at the Baruch College, and also he's the former president of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. In Havana, Cuba, we invited Carlos Alzugare, who is a professor of international relations at the University of Havana. He is also the former Cuban ambassador to Brussels. Welcome, gentlemen, to our program. How much change, Professor Hanken, from the U.S. side do you expect that President Trump likely to announce later today, your time on Friday?
My expectation, actually, surprisingly, for many, is that the change is not going to be as wholesale or as a complete 180-degree reversal as many people had expected or even feared. I think Obama managed to get enough people to support, invested in his policy, to defend his policy in the business world and otherwise, so that I think that the framework of embassies, diplomatic relations, and actually a lot of the commercial flights, the Cuban-American free travel to Cuba is going to remain. Even cruise ships will remain. What I expect he'll do and what the news reports have shown is that he's going to try to hit the military holdings within the economy, especially in the tourism sector, and also restrict the travel of Americans who are not of Cuban descent from doing any tourism in Cuba.
But you know very well, Professor Hanken, I mean, when it comes to so-called military-backed companies from Cuba, this is a very vague idea. I mean, Cuba is a socialist economy, and therefore many of their companies are actually state-owned or partially state-owned, has some ties with the military, minor or major. So you never know, and therefore it could be a very flexible terminology. Will that hurt Cuban economies, or actually it is only one of the terms President Trump wants to use in order to show he's different?
I agree. I think he's trying to look and act tough, and we'll see him talk today, and I'm sure that he will gesticulate like he does and claim that he has the support of all Cuban Americans, which he doesn't. But I think that what's going to be really hard in practice, and I think even impossible in practice, is to keep this strike against the Cuban economy controlled by the government from harming everyday Cubans, especially the new entrepreneurial class, because as you very well said, the economy in practice is intertwined. The state sector and the private sector that's growing is really intertwined, and someone on the street in Cuba, a tourist, is not going to know exactly who owns or who runs or controls the entity. The United States government is going to try to publish a list, but that's going to be really, I think, cumbersome and clumsy.
Professor Alzagari, do you think Cubans are ready for this? I mean, of course, a new president come up, want to be different, particularly want to be different from the previous president, particularly for Donald Trump.
Well, this is not the first time. When President Reagan replaced President Carter, he did exactly the same thing, even worse. President Carter had opened travel to Cuba, and President Reagan prohibited it. In the change between President Bush and President Clinton, the same thing. Between President Clinton and President Bush, the same thing. So it's like a roller coaster. We go up and then we go down. So we are ready, and we knew that Mr. Trump's rhetoric on Cuba changed very substantially from the period when he was running for the nomination of the Republican Party to now, to when he was running for president. The paradoxical thing is that when he was running for the nomination, Rubio was the hardliner, and he beat Rubio in Florida. So this doesn't seem to be, from the standpoint of domestic politics in the United States, doesn't seem to be a good deal for Mr. Trump, because he's taking the hardline position, or not completely the hardline position, of Marco Rubio, who he defeated in Florida.
But you know,
and now
Professor,
in Cuba, we are ready.
Professor Alzagari, we have to be frank here. I mean, President Trump, when he was a candidate, he was never favored by Latino voters. It was used to be the one that's called the Hillary Clinton that has been being, according to the surveys, loved by Latino voters. So what would this further policy coming from the president now, not candidate, mean for Latino voters? Don't forget, there is the midterm election.
Listen, he didn't win Florida because of the Latino or the Cuban American vote. He won Florida because of the white American vote. What I'm saying, basically, from the standpoint of American domestic politics, it doesn't give him any advantage to support a hardline policy, because most Cuban Americans, as your report demonstrated, are now favorable to normal relations with Cuba. So he's not going to win any votes with this move. From the standpoint of domestic politics, from the standpoint of international relations, you know, most of the world applauded President Obama, including many of the Latin American countries. Now, many of the Latin American countries are not going to like this move. So we are back, but we are not so much back, because diplomatic relations are going to stay.
All right.
For example, these guys, Marco Rubio, were demanding limiting the travel of Cuban Americans to Cuba in and the remittances, and that didn't happen. So it's not that bad.
Professor Hankin, though, Cuban Americans inside the United States, as we know, are pretty much divided when it comes to whether to have a closer relationship with Cuba due to different reasons they came to the United States or their families originally came to the United States. So what do you think about Professor Elzegarri's early arguments that, you know, maybe the Cuban Americans going to push for this, push for better?
Well, unfortunately, I cannot hear anything that Carlos is saying for some reason in the audio. But I can imagine that, I mean, there's a division, and I think the division is generally one of generations. The youngest people in Cuban Americans tend to support free travel, tend to be against the embargo, and tend to support the opening. And even some of the old hardliners have changed stripes because the ability to affect change in Cuba, to have a people-to-people relationship, to support relatives, to support new businesses, is something that many people have longed to do for many years and is now possible under the previous administration's changes. And one of the things I think that was strategic about Trump's policy, and we'll see today if this is true, is that he's going to not touch the ability of Cuban Americans to travel to the island and to send remittances to the island. And so I think that that is something that Obama should be credited with, because he's established a new normal. Don't mess with Cuban American right to travel to Cuba.
Right.
Don't mess with their ability to send money to support their relatives. And I think that that's an important change from the past.
But you know, Professor Hankin, I mean, even about the President Obama, they promised a lot in their policy papers, but eventually the implementation of all of them have been, as some argue, not necessarily satisfying. What do you make of the result of the Obama policy so far?
Well, I think depending on what measure you use to judge it. I mean, the Obama administration never claimed that they would affect. I think it was wildly successful based on the measure that they went out and they set out to establish. They never claimed that they were going to change Cuba overnight. What they wanted to do is remove the United States from the equation and let Cubans and the Cuban people and the relationship between the Cuban government and the Cuban people be the one that determined Cuba's future, not an external actor by like the United States, but also the United States could be a positive element in helping to empower small businesses and helping Cubans get access to telecommunications, to information, so that they could be part of the modern world. And I think in all of those areas, it has been successful. I think the only area that you could say has been unsuccessful in the short term is that the numbers of business deals, the numbers of deals, especially with the private sector, have been minimal. And so that is in some ways, the thing that is being used by Trump to justify his changes, because some of the deals have been made directly with the Cuban government and even the military holdings in the tourism sector. And so that's the vulnerable point that I think that Trump is going to take advantage of today.
But you know, Professor Elzegarri, I mean, some of the most important barometers to measure the previous administration's policies and its implementations is about how much really business interactions really happen and how much sanctions have been lifted against Cuba as a result of commonly agreed policies between the United States and Cuba. What do you think about the previous policies, particularly implementations?
I think that implementation was difficult because of a number of reasons. You know, you cannot eliminate overnight 50 years of the most encompassing economic sanctions that the world has ever seen. Take the case of credit cards. The Treasury Department announced in 2015 that Americans would be able to use their credit cards in Cuba, but the banks refused to do it because they said it's too much risk. We don't know what's going to happen. So obviously that's part of the problem. But having said that, I think first Obama took a major step by first publicly recognizing the policy had failed. Most American politicians know that the policy of trying to pressure Cuba, to pressure the Cuban people to overthrow their government, which is what these policies are about, didn't work. And not only that, it didn't isolate Cuba. Cuba became a significant actor in the international scene. So the policy failed. Now, Obama did something that was politically costly, which is to change a policy that apparently was written on stone. Having done that, he went ahead to say, we're going to normalize relations, accepting normalization of relations, which is so simple for any kind of couple of neighbors, but for Cuba and the United States, it's quite complicated.
I see.
Now, he was tied. His hands were tied by Congress. He couldn't do much more than he did, but what he did had an impact in Cuba, a very positive impact economically in Cuba. Though from the political standpoint, there might be some discussion, but it had an economic impact and supported the reform process that the Cuban government is carrying out.
I see. Professor Hong Kong, before we go, I do want to pose this question to you as well. Cuban policy does not exist in the U.S. foreign policy book as a very separate page, but rather it is also linked with the U.S. policy in its quote-unquote backyard, namely South America, Latin America, the Caribbean area. So what do you think this time the change or the possible change, or at least the air of talking about possible change, mean for the U.S. policy in the region? And how do you think the rest of the region will look at Washington now? Professor Hong Kong.
Well, judging from the fact that the region embraced and celebrated Barack Obama's policy, any reversal of that policy and the region's criticism of the embargo traditionally will be met with great consternation and condemnation throughout the hemisphere. The United States is again going it alone, just like it did when it pulled out of the Paris climate change agreement. And here it's going to be going it alone. It's also going to make the measures that Trump is going to try to implement much, much less effective, because the United States is going to be the only country in the world that's going to be implementing them. And the arguments about human rights and democracy are going to fall on deaf ears around the hemisphere, because Trump has had no problem cozying up and having a positive relationship with repressive regimes in the Philippines, Russia, and we have a positive relationship with the country of China, and Trump has had a meeting already with the president of China. But on the other hand, he's attacking Cuba and trying to isolate and cut off its economy. It's not going to make sense to people in Latin America, and they're going to see it really as pandering to the Cuban American hardliners, not as really any good policy for international relations toward a foreign country.
All right. Ted Hong Kong, Carlos Elzagali. Gentlemen, thank you. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, still to come on our program. In the run-up to the 20th anniversary of the Hong Kong's return to China, we'll have the first episode of our special program, the Trailblazing Hong Kong Women. Today, we speak with RITA FAN, the first president of Hong Kong's legislature. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. It has been 20 years since Hong Kong returned to China. That moment symbolized the reunification of China and remains one of the most meaningful events in modern Chinese history. Many people made their mark and played important roles in this process. And today we are going to meet one of them and hear her tell her stories. RITA FAN, the former president of the Legislative Council of Hong Kong.
An exceptional female politician. RITA FAN was the first president of the Hong Kong Legislative Council after Hong Kong was returned to its motherland in 1997. Her career in politics is nothing less than legendary. RITA FAN was a member of the Hong Kong Legislative Council since 1983. She suggested that the British Hong Kong government repatriate Vietnamese boat people to protect the interests of the Hong Kong residents. However, due to a differing political stance from the last governor, Christopher Patten, she aligned herself with the Communist Party of China, a controversial move at the time. Some even mocked her as a chameleon, went through a lot in her career, but that did not stop her. The situation soon cooled, and she was even voted as the most supported legislator in an opinion poll by the University of Hong Kong. Even though she no longer serves in the Legislative Council, she is still active in politics, serving as a member of the Hong Kong delegation to the 11th National People's Congress of the People's Republic of China.
It was the colonial government, the British Hong Kong administration.
Yes.
So I was not sure.
Why?
Well, I don't have the ability. I mean, everyone in the Legislative Council are well known with high position. They are the rich and the famous, and I'm nobody. And my husband told me, well, try it. This is just part of your life, you know. Experience it, and you know, in 2 years they won't reappoint you. So I joined, and that's the beginning of a so-called political career. Sir Edward Yeo and then Sir David Wilson, they are all career diplomats and they know China very well. When Mr. Chris Patten lost his seat in Bath in the general election, he was appointed the governor of Hong Kong. And I saw him before he came out to Hong Kong. And we talk about Hong Kong. He wanted to know how to deal with the Chinese. So I said to him, I think the best way is behind closed door, you can argue as you wish. But once the door is open, everybody has to be very polite. And it is only in this way that you can get some of the things you want. But of course, he never listened. I think he looked for an honorable withdrawal. He looked for an impression. He wants to create an impression that Britain is very strong, although we are withdrawing from Hong Kong, we're still very strong. And for himself, he wants to make a name to be seen as the person who introduced democracy into Hong Kong.
Was that when you were disappointed?
Well, actually, after 2 meetings in the Executive Council, I already decided that we are not on the same path. I feel so relieved when I resigned because not only I no longer need to sort of work for a governor whose intentions I do not particularly agree with, but the more important thing is I would have time for myself.
When did the Chinese side approach you?
Oh, it's 1 year later. In early 1994, I was approached, and they told me that they would like to set up a working committee for the preparatory committee. So they asked me whether I would like to participate.
And you were, Mrs. Fan, after you accepted the invitation from the Chinese side to work on this preparation committee's future work, being labeled as traitor and as someone who goes against your original promises, as not a graceful woman, all of these. What was it like for you?
Yes, I was criticized much stronger than I thought. But one thing I was very sure of is that I will reflect the views of a Hong Kong belonger in a frank and open manner. I do not intend to say things that will please people. It is my responsibility to say what I feel and tell them what I see, what I hear. I went through a very soul-searching period. I said, why is it that people doesn't understand? I have always wanted to serve Hong Kong, and I am serving Hong Kong. So at the beginning, I tried to explain. And then I find that by explaining, I get into even deeper waters. So then I realized I cannot change people. I can't change what they think. I can't change what they say. And I certainly cannot influence what they write. But I can change myself.
How did you change yourself?
I can make my statements short, concise, explicit. The chances of misinterpretation will be less. I can try to say my piece in a logical way so that everyone will understand what I'm talking about. And the third thing I learned is no point in getting angry about it. Smile when you are saying things which can cause a lot of reaction.
It's impossible for others to imagine themselves into your shoes at the time to go through all of these, particularly when the future is still not certain.
Yes, but you know, if I get angry and I explode it before the camera, I won't get my message across. And I would be hurting my own cause.
But you're also hurting yourself because you seem to bury all of those very strong emotions within yourself.
Yes, that's why I suppose I got breast cancer later on in life. I mean, anyone who has a very intense period, lots of pressure and lots of unhappiness, it will show later on in life.
What did you do in order to smooth yourself up after every of those intense occasions?
Well, I get, after doing these, everybody says I'm very calm and friendly in front of the camera. But then after that, I would go home and maybe I would beat up my pillow. Or
you did really?
Oh yes, of course. And I live nearby the sea, so I go out to the beach and then shout. Because in winter, nobody is in the beach, so you can shout as much as you like, particularly when there's a strong wave. You just have to get the steam out of your body. You get it out. And once you get it out, you're calm again. Then I can reflect the next step. How do I do it? Because in those days, the pressure, particularly when I become the president of the Provisional Legislative Council, now this organization is an organization that the British government opposed. So therefore, Chris Patten will be...
You're the target.
The council is the target.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Chris Patten will be saying all these things during the week, and during the weekend, all the Hong Kong media will come to Shenzhen, where we were having our meetings. And they would ask me those questions, and I would respond. So it's a kind of sort of, this is Chris Patten, this is RITA FAN, talking about each other. But as far as I'm concerned, it is my responsibility as the president to ensure that people understand what the Provisional Legislative Council is doing, so that even though they may not agree with us, at least they got the truth. So it was quite not an easy time.
Yes, indeed, the political fights were ferocious, but RITA FAN survived them and even thrived amid them. She had strong support from her husband, Fan Shengtek. Their marriage lasted 30 years until his death from liver cancer. In the last few months of his life, Rita did all she could to keep his company. But that was not the only challenge her family went through. In the past 20-some years, in fact, one after another, her daughter suffered from failure. Rita donated a kidney to save her life. Later, Rita herself was diagnosed with breast cancer and had to undergo a mastectomy as well. Despite all of these, today she is still full of gratitude. You talked a lot, Mrs. Fan, about your husband. I knew the story of your family, of course. What has been that relationship like with him?
Well, I think he is the one person that gave me the stability and security that I need. I feel that...
people would ask, oh, Mrs. Fan even need security.
Oh, I'm quite insecure in my earlier days. I am not confident. I feel insecure actually before I got married.
Why?
I don't have a very nice childhood, I'm afraid. So you see, when a young person grows up in a family where there's lots of struggling and arguments, you don't feel secure or confident. But then once I got married, I found my place in the world, and I have settled down and feel very, very comfortable.
And discussions one after another.
Yes, and at all the critical time, I always feel I would ask his opinion, because my husband is a very balanced person. He's not one of those high flyers, but he is there. He's always there when I needed him, and well, he's just wonderful.
But then your professional career changed so much over the years. You seem to got very prominent, and you still need to consult your husband?
Of course.
Only one you really trust.
Well, he understands me. You know, if you ask someone for advice and that person doesn't understand you, then the advice would be quite far-fetched. But my husband understands me. He knows my weakness. You see, it's very important that someone knows you as you are. Your weaknesses, what you are unable to do.
Yeah.
A person that you can face and open yourself with no reserve. That is the person who can, like my husband, who can walk the road of life with me.
Almost 30 years, so many things happen to you professionally. That also means happen to your family. Because they have to shoulder all of those labels others give to you, the difficulties that you have to face, probably even maximized for them. Is it fair for them?
No, it's not fair for them. And that's why I always feel that I owe them, I will always owe them.
But they don't feel that way.
Well, I know my husband don't feel that way. As for the my children, I'm afraid they really have too much pressure. But fortunately, they are now grown up, and it's their turn to look after me.
What have they learned, do you think, through the time in which you were struggling politically?
I think my daughter decided that she would never go down the same path.
And she didn't have the chance, by the way. Hong Kong already returned back to China. But anyway,
Yes.
When did she tell you about this?
Oh no, she never said anything. But I
you
knew. I knew, yes. But she's very happy with her career, so that's fine. You know. My son is beginning to feel that maybe what Mom did was not that unacceptable. He's beginning to feel differently. And when he was young, he said, "Oh, I won't have anything to do with that
With you, Mrs. Fan."
But they were, in another way, they were very fortunate because their grandma, my husband's mom, was a very, very kind,
caring
person, and they grew up in an atmosphere of love.
And you went through difficulties yourself.
Yeah.
Disease, family crisis in terms of health. How did you go through that? I mean, on the one hand, you got difficult political challenges. You got people who did not trust you, who talk bad about you, even though you believed at the time 100% you're doing something right. On the other hand, pressure on your family, health issues, one after another. Mrs. Fan, how did you do it?
Well, I suppose, I think what really was a strike for me is when I heard that my daughter was unwell. So I decided that I would drop everything and to be by her side. I feel it was so, fate has given her such a raw deal because she doesn't deserve it. She was so young. But both of us, maybe in our veins, we are optimists. So we accepted what happened and we tried to work from that basis to go forward. And things gradually worked out.
What has that taught you?
I think
it was a very intense time.
Yes, it is. I think the first thing is we must family is very precious. Things that we thought take for granted, family, children, actually I could lose it overnight. So
just like that.
Just like that, yes. So we really have to be, how should I say it? You have to spend time with your family. I regretted that I didn't give my children too much time. but I was very fortunate. I was given a chance to compensate. So I was with her all those months. And then I was so fortunate that our matching was good. So I was able to give her one of my kidney. And she's been using it now for over 20 years. That's wonderful.
Do you two talk about that?
No, we don't. I think we just like to live life in a normal way. We don't have to talk about these illness, this misfortune. We look ahead.
And you were also with your husband when he was experiencing the most important, the most difficult time of his life.
Well,
you were there,
yes,
traveling back and forth, Beijing, Hong Kong, all the time, just to be with him.
Yes, that was his last 3 weeks, and well, I cannot stay away. I'm sorry. You know, so I do my duty. I go back to chair the meeting, and then I fly to Beijing to see him because he wanted to come to Beijing. In Hong Kong, we cannot have Chinese medicine and Western medicine together. He feels that here he might be able to have the benefit of both. But it was, anyway.
Quality time, was it?
Not really, because he was not feeling well. But I know he would like to have me by his side, and I was there. And when I'm not here, his sister, my sister-in-law is here. So he was never really alone. And that's what we wanted, to make sure that he knows we care for him.
Hong Kong in the past 20 years has been trying to figure out many things, including what kind of chief executive will be able to lead the SAR into a better future. It seems that RITA FAN has had her answer now. Before the election earlier this year, she already joined the Carrie Lam's campaign office and worked around the clock. Now, Carrie Lam is the new Hong Kong chief executive. I asked RITA FAN if she believes Lam will be able to handle thorny issues in the future.
The political scene has deteriorated to such a situation that we really needed someone who is prepared to stand up to pressure, who is not afraid of speaking his or her mind, who has this track record that we know this is a person who we can trust. And Carrie Lam has all that.
You have really confidence in her?
Yes.
You don't think she's going to disappoint you?
Well, if she disappoints me, I think it's not because of a lack of trying. It's because the circumstances and all the other factors were just too much. Many people are surprised. I do not know Carrie personally.
I was just about to ask.
Yes, we are not close friends or anything like that. But I saw her growing up. I saw her years ago when she was the Secretary for Development.
Yes.
Going out by herself in a t-shirt to Staff Area where all the demonstrators are there, and she talked to them for 2 hours. Oh, they use all kinds of languages against her. And for those 2 hours, you see she was very angry, she was not smiling, but she kept her calm. Now, I do not see anyone in the Hong Kong administration with that kind of courage and ability. By the way, she's a woman. That's the first woman chief executive we have. And I think she will bring to the political arena the kind of influence that we really need. You find it very surprising. Ever since Mrs. Carrie Lam was elected, we have been very quiet in Hong Kong. And I hope that this would give us the breathing space that we need. This would give us the impetus to remove all this over-politicizing everything. And let's get down to business. Because only when we can get down to business, get our act together, then Hong Kong has a future.
And that was our exclusive interview with RITA FAN. And that is also the first part, special series, Trailblazing Hong Kong Women. All the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight with Tianwei CGTN, in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo as well. From me, Tianwei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next week for insights across China and around the world. Have a great weekend.